Professor Shumir Chakraborty is a professor from the Department of English of Presidency University. In fact, he teaches English literature. And Professor Chakraborty specializes in post colonial and culture studies. And when I was just reading a little bit about Professor Chakraborty's work, it is mind blowingly impressive. But one of the areas which I found particularly interesting is that he straddles both disciplines, that is, English and history, which, as you know, is my personal favorite discipline. So, Professor Chakraborty has engaged with literatures of the Holocaust and of other, as he terms it, forced migrations. And presently, Professor Chakraborty is writing a monograph on Akshay Kumar Datto and rationalism, again with a period which is very, very precious and close to my heart, and that is 19th century Bengal. Professor Chakraborty has visited and taught and researched in educational institutions across the globe. And as Professor Chakraborty himself shared his introduction, which I found really fascinating, he loves to cook, he loves going on long walks along unknown roads, as he said. He claims to have learned more from random strangers in different parts of the world than from all the books that he has read. Professor Chakraborty, it is indeed a pleasure to have you with us. And Indus Valley World School is privileged that our Republic Day annual lecture this year will be delivered by a person who is as erudite as you. So it's over to you, Professor Chakraborty.
Thank you, Ms. Prasad, and thank you for this very warm welcome. And it's also a privilege on my part and an honor to be able to address your students today and to my fellow faculty members at the Indus Valley World School. Now, I will speak for about roughly between 20 and 30 minutes. A couple of things before I begin my talk is that, first of all, it's good that I am addressing students who are from classes 11 and 12, because I'd like to treat them as adults. I generally speak to my classes which are about just a bit senior than the people I'm meeting here today. And I treat all my students as adults. So I'll treat them as adults. And I like to talk to them in terms of how, if you've seen the title of my talk, is that how do we, each one of us, see ourselves as part of this republic, and what do we need to do, or how do we need to go about being citizens of India and the world. You know, when we were students, we were kids, and we were invited to such talks, we would prepare ourselves to listen to very boring talks on people who have been very glorious people, but who have no connection to the lives that we lead today. In certain ways, in so many ways, they were all great people, but we've lost connect with them in so many ways. When I was invited by Ms. Prasad for this talk, I was thinking, because this is how I generally talk to my students when I talk to them about literature, or I talk to them about literary theory. I would want to speak to all of you, all my students here, in a way in which, you know, our lives, the way we connect to our nation, the way we connect to our daily lives, there is some relevance between what Republic Day means to us and to the lives that we lead every day. It is this everydayness that I would want to connect to in my talk today. Now, one of the things that you would notice when you look around yourselves in your lives is that most of us lead lives which are determined in so many ways by certain parameters that have been set for us by the society, by the people around us, by our mentors, teachers, parents. And there is a certain sense of, once again, everydayness, a sense of unsurprising ease with which we lead our lives, or unsurprising difficulty with which we lead our lives. In technical terms, when you belong to a humanities classroom, you will know that we call this, there's a term for this, and we call this discourse. Now, the dictionary meaning of the word discourse would give you a meaning that says, for example, a discourse on malaria, a discourse on cricket. So a tract, a piece of writing or something like that. In technical terms, within the ambit of humanities studies, discourse has a slightly different meaning. And I will give you a very easy definition of discourse today. Discourse is a set of rules that we follow without thinking. Let me give you an example. For example, when the teacher walks into the class, all of us stand up. Now, if I were to ask you, why do you stand up when the teacher enters the classroom? I know the answer to it. Your ready-made answer is, well, this is out of respect. Think about this deeply. Think about this. Stand aside and think about this. You stand up while thinking about cricket, about the film that you were watching last night, about what you have for your lunch today. So it almost becomes an automatic reaction. You're standing up. It becomes an automatic reaction to the teachers entering the classroom, and you do it without thinking. There are so many activities every day that we do without thinking and are part of our discourse. For example, you will know the way you speak to your teacher is not the same way that you talk to your parents, or the same way you chat with your friends. Each of these ways of saying or ways of speaking have a particular discourse, and you follow that automatically. You don't have to think. When you talk to your friend, you don't have to think that you're not talking to your teacher right now. It comes to you automatically. Now, where does this idea of the discourse come from? Where do you get this idea of discourse? How do you learn to think this automatically in your lives, in your everyday existence? For example, let us say the first book that most of us are introduced to when somebody has raised a hand. I don't know. Okay, I'll come back to Shreyas. Anyway, so the thing is, so when the first time you're learning to read something, you are introduced to a primer where you learn your alphabets, A, B, C, D, and you learn your language. You start learning your language. You start articulating yourself to the world, not through gestures, but for the first time through written and spoken language. And that is a primer. You know, most of us who have studied Bengali, we were introduced for the first time to a primer. Even our parents were, we were, and I'm sure many of you were, introduced to the Bangla language through Borno Porichoy. Borno Porichoy, familiar text written by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. Now, for those of you who've read Borno Porichoy, you will know that Borno Porichoy tells us the story of two boys, Gopal and Rakhal. And Gopal, Boro Shubodh Balok. Gopal is a good boy. And why is Gopal a Shubodh Balok or a good boy? Because there is a set of rules that Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar lays down, which Gopal follows. For example, he listens to his parents. He always listens to his Guru Moshai. He is someone who does his homework on time, does his classwork on time. He goes to the playground on time. He comes back on time. And he also teaches his siblings. And all in all, he is the perfect embodiment of a good child. As opposed to him is Rakhal. And Rakhal is the exact foil of Gopal. He's all that Gopal is not. And then what does Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar tell us? He tells us, be like, and what do your parents tell you when you read Borno Porichoy? Be like Gopal, don't be like Rakhal. Now, if you look at the history of the world, if you look at all that is good, all that is wonderful, all that is amazing, you'll see that most of these amazing things, wonderful things, have been done by Rakhals in the world and not by Gopals. One of the strangest irony is this, that in spite of the fact that all our parents have wanted us to be like Gopals, we become the regular Gopals. And if there is, you first become Gopal to your parents, then you become Gopal to your teachers, then you become Gopal to your professors in college, university, then you become a Gopal to your employee. And then finally you become a Gopal to your state. So you say nothing, do nothing, you just follow rules. This is where the idea of discourse comes from. You see, it is ingrained in us from the very moment we start to read. There's one other thing that I always point out to my students, that, a primer like Borno Porichoy, which was written in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, even today, we read this primer in most Bengali schools. Borno Porichoy is still taught. Borno Porichoy, in spite of the fact that Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was a great voice for the emancipation of women, it does not talk about a Gopali or a Rakhali. It never talks about a woman, although when Borno Porichoy was being written, schools for women were already there in Kolkata, in Calcutta. Even today we read the Borno Porichoy, and when we live in a time when women's liberation, women's education, all these are things of the past. We're already there in so many ways, and yet we do not question that very first primer that we read. When a little girl reads Borno Porichoy, does she not wonder, what happened to me? It talks about my brother. It talks about my friend. What happened to me? Where am I in this? So you see, the first reaction that I would want you to have when you face this world is to start to question this idea of discourse, this idea of an all-abiding set of rules that is given you, always already given you by your parents, by the system. Try and question it. Now, The question is, how do I question it? My answer would be, question it by starting to think for yourself. That is the way forward. When I say this, it is easy to say, you're not thinking. It is easy to say that think for yourself. Where is your tool? With what do you think? Question is, how do you begin to think? There is no one answer to this. There is no one way of going about it, and there is no formula for thinking, because a formula for thinking would expose you to another set of discourses. Because once again, your parents, your teachers, your state will teach you to think in a particular way. I will tell you 3 short stories, events, each one of them meaning something, and I would not tell you the meaning. I would just ask you, once I stop speaking, once after the lecture is over, think about the implications of what I told you, and this might be a good starting point for beginning to think. The first one is an interesting event that Plato, the philosopher, you've all heard of Plato. Plato talks about, and Plato is writing about his teacher, Socrates. Socrates, as you know, was the wise old man from Greece. So Socrates, one day, Socrates, as you know, he's immensely respected in Athens, and he is the philosopher of the times. And he is waiting at the courts of Athens to begin a certain case against someone called Meletus. It is not important. What is important is, while he's waiting on the porch, he meets a young boy called Euthyphro. Euthyphro is also well known in Athens because he's a fine boy. He's well educated. He has impressed his teachers. He's like the first boy of the times. We always like first boys and first girls. So Euthyphro is one such, and he is a model student, somebody whom everyone likes. So Socrates is a bit surprised this morning to find Euthyphro in the court, and says, Euthyphro, you are a good boy, and this is not the place for you. This is a court, this is a criminal court, and why are you here? Euthyphro says, Socrates, I'm here to lodge a complaint. Complaint? What kind of complaint? Well, to lodge a complaint about homicide. Socrates is like, homicide? Against whom? Who has killed whom? He says, well, I'm here to lodge a complaint against my father. Now, Euthyphro's father was a very well-respected man in Athens, and Socrates is aghast. He says, what has your father done now? And what is this that you are his son and you've come here to lodge a complaint against him? What has he done? So he says, Euthyphro says, we have some land in a place called Naxos. Naxos is somewhere off Athens, about a few miles, about 50 or so miles from Athens. And there they have a piece of land. And so he says, my father and I, we went to our piece of land in Naxos, and we went there with a few laborers because we wanted to till the land. So these laborers, they were working when one of them got drunk and he killed another person. So Socrates says, oh, okay, that's wrong. So yes, Euthyphro says, yes, that's wrong, of course. And so my father caught this man, this murderer, and threw him into the prison, and then sent someone to Athens to know what is to be done with this particular prisoner. So, it takes about 3 days to come to Athens and then go back. In the meanwhile, because he was a murderer, my father refused to look after him. He forgot about him completely. He ignored him completely, and this man died. I am here to lodge a complaint against my father for neglecting someone who has died without a trial. You understand that this is a very complex story, and from here on, Plato goes on to talk about the idea of ethics and the idea of what it is that we need to think about, what each one of us needs to do in a particular situation. This is story number 1. The second story is a story about the Holocaust. There is a very famous Polish filmmaker called Krzysztof Kieślowski, and he made a film, and I'm sure some of you have already heard of Kieślowski. If not, please try and watch Kieślowski's films sometimes. So one of his films is a long 10-hour film called Decalogue. Decalogue, as you understand, Deca, 10. So it's a set of 10 stories, 1 hour each, and so it's 10 hours. You don't have to watch it all at one go. You can choose one story one day and watch it. It is worth a watch. I'm going to tell you about the 8th story of the Decalogue, Decalogue 8. Oh, by the way, about Holocaust, you see, one other thing that I always tell my students, and I'm telling you as well, is that sometime in your life, whenever it's possible, gather some money, whenever it is possible in your life, and make a trip to Auschwitz. Auschwitz, as you know, is the concentration camp near Krakow, a city in Poland, and Auschwitz and Birkenau are 2 camps about 2 kilometers apart. And you must take that walk one day in your life, sometime. And I tell you today, it will change you as a person. It will change you from inside. Something radical is going to happen inside you when you take that walk. It is an important walk to take. Anyway, coming back to Decalogue 8, the story. So this is the story of a professor, and her name is Sophia, and she's a very famous professor of Jewish history at the University of Warsaw. Now, what is happening is she is delivering a course on ethics at the time this film is shot. And there is a student who has come from America. Her name is Elizabeth, a young student who is a great fan of this professor. She has read all of Sophia's works. She's very interested in writing about Sophia and her works. And she has requested to be a part of this class on ethics. So there's this classroom, and so Professor Sophia is teaching. And at the end of the class, she says, "Do you have any questions about ethics to ask?" And so Elisabetta, she raises her hand and says, "I'll tell you a story, and I'll ask you what to do." The story goes like this. Once upon a time in 1943, you see 1943 because the Second War was on. And you know about the history of the Nazis, how they were hunting Jews all around the place in Europe. And she says, Elisabetta, she says that, so in 1943, there was this little girl, about 5 years old, and there was a man who took this little girl, 5-year-old girl, Jewish girl and knocked at the door of a Christian couple. They were a very nice couple. They were well read, they were learned, they were compassionate. And this man, once the woman opened the door, this man requested this woman to take the little girl in. Why? Because the Nazis were all around the place and were looking for Jews. And if they found this little Jewish girl, they'll send her directly to the concentration camp. So in order to save her life, this man begged this couple, this very learned, erudite young couple, to take in this little girl and act as if this little girl was a Christian, if the Nazis came to ask. Then Elzbieta says, you know what this couple did? You know, they're very kind people. I could see from their, she says, one could see from their faces that they were very nice, friendly, compassionate people. But they said two things. One, that they were surely going to take that girl in. No problem. A, because it was ethical to take that girl in, this little girl, 5-year-old girl in. But they were good Christians. They were also ethical, religious, deeply religious and ethical Christians. And so, if the Nazis came to ask, they would not lie. So they would both take her in and not lie. So the man went away with that girl and never came back. Then Elzbieta asks, do you know what happened to that girl? Or may I ask you, what should she have done? Did she do the right thing? If you know the story, you'll slowly get to know that Elzbieta was that little girl, and this famous professor, Zofia, she was that woman at that time. So Elzbieta had come back to ask this question of this famous professor, what was the right thing to do? Once again, asking each one of us to think at the moment of our action. The last story with which I'm going to end my talk today is a real life story, not from a film, not from a book, but something that happened to my friend, and my friend recounted this story to me. So this friend of mine, they were all students at a mission school in Purulia. And this mission school, this was about 20 years or so back. This mission school, every year it gave out, during the winter months particularly, blankets and some rice to the poor people of Purulia. So there was a day designated for this particular job. And every year, poor people from all over Purulia and adjacent places would come to collect this blanket and some amount of rice from the school. So on one of these occasions, as they were distributing the blankets and the rice to this poor and old people, there's this one lone man whom most of them knew because he was a beggar. He used to beg for alms at Purulia station or on the station road or etc. And they knew him by his face. He was known there. That this man is a very poor man, and he was old and poor. And he was standing at a distance and not coming up. So my friend and some of his friends, they had called him twice or thrice, you can come, you can take the blanket and the rice. Why are you standing there? And he was just staying put. He would not move. So they ignored him then, and they went on with their job of the day. When they were almost done, this old man hobbles up to them And they were like a little miffed. We've been calling you for so long, and now we're almost done with the blankets. There are no good ones left, and you are here. We've been calling you for the last 2 hours. This man says, আমি কিছু নিতে আসিনি, আমি দিতে এসেছি. I've not come here to take anything. I've come here to give something. Because I know this day is there, and I have got blankets and rice from you every day of the year. This time I decided that I'll collect all that I can from my alms, from all that I collect. For 3 days I've collected these, and I want to give it so that you can give it to somebody. This was such a fascinating event that it not only left a mark on him, my friend, but he tells this to us so many times that I've heard this story. And once again, this makes you think that who is capable of giving? What is the ethics that one must follow in order to lead a good life, an important life, a life that matters? I'll end by saying that, through all of this, what I wanted to tell you is think. Think for yourself. Don't let anyone else think for you. Think for yourself and be good citizens. You will be good citizens if you start to think. That is all. Thank you very much.